Hello, hello, my name is Rachel, and today I want to look back at a decade of reading. So, since this is the end of the decade, I thought I would take a look at some books from this year compared to books over the decade of reading. So let's go ahead and jump in. So first off is the book that I have reread the most. So this year in 2019, I haven't really reread anything within the year. Like I didn't read anything like at the beginning of the year and before the year was over, read the book again. So I've only read each book once this year, but I did have 4 books that I revisited this year from previous years. So first up, I read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. I read that a really long time ago. But with the movie coming out and it just being super hyped again, I thought I would reread it. Obviously, it didn't really stand up as an adult. The pictures were absolutely the creepiest part, but that was when I reread. I also reread another favorite of mine that, again, did not hold up over time, and that is Blood and Chocolate by Annette Curtis Claus. And this was one of my favorite books when I was a teenager, preteen maybe, and it just did not hold up. I did not really enjoy the reread. I found it very problematic as an adult, but I did reread it this year, and yeah, that counted as one of my rereads. I also reread Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, and I am just not like super into poetry. I think it's fine, but I reread it to kind of look into some poetry books for school. So it was kind of a work-related read, but I did reread that one. And then the last reread that I had of the year was The World of Lore, Monstrous Creatures, the first book in the World of Lore series by Erin Mankey. And I love those lore books. It's based on a podcast. There's also a TV show on Amazon Prime, but I think the books are my favorite way to take in these short little lore stories, and I think they're fantastic. I reread it with my high school students for our book club this year, and they absolutely loved it, so I will probably be rereading more lore books in the future, because I've read all 3 that are currently out, but that was the last one that I reread this year. Now, over the past 10 years, I have reread several books, but the ones that I have reread the most is a very interesting collection. So first up is Shiver by Maggie Stiefvater. Over the last 10 years, I've read it 4 times. Now, I know here on BookTube, it is not a favorite. People are not in love with that book. They much prefer the Raven Cycle series, but I don't know what it is about it. Like, I'm totally willing to admit that it's like cheesy. Like the romance is a little like weird. I mean, there's problems with Shiver, I think we can all admit, but it's still Maggie Stiefvater's writing, which is just beautiful. It's still this kind of like magical world that she brings us into. And for some reason, I absolutely love the series. And I've read Shiver 4 times over the past 10 years, and I guarantee you I will read it more over the next 10. I just love that series, and I won't stop reading it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I love it. I've also reread Pride and Prejudice 3 times over the past 10 years. That is probably my favorite book. I just absolutely love the story. I don't have time to sit and read it all of the time because it's pretty lengthy, but I do listen to the audiobook pretty frequently, and at least just like snippets of it when I'm kind of in the mood for a little Jane Austen fix, and I watch the movie like all the time when I don't have time to read the full book. So I love that book. I've read it 3 times over the past 10 years, and again, I will read it many more times. So next up is the most memorable book. Now, I feel like this was like a weird way to word this, but it was like the book that I feel like was the first one that came to my mind when I thought, okay, what book do I remember reading this year versus what book like stood out for me this decade. So this was super hard. For the year, it was kind of easy. I picked Two Truths and a Lie. This is a series that is a juvenile nonfiction series by Ami Joan Paquette and Laurie Ann Thompson. And basically, it's just such a neat format. And I think that's why it was the most memorable for me. They present different chapters in each book, and there's 3 sections in each chapter. And two of the sections are factually based and one of them is completely fabricated, or at least the details are fabricated. Maybe it's based on like a rumor or some folklore or something, but it's fabricated. There's no evidence of it being true. And you as a reader get to either just use context clues within the story to decide if it's true or not, or you could even use that to launch into practicing research and researching if it's true or not. And I just think this is such an interesting format for a book, especially like a children's book, that I just loved it. I thought it was super cool, very memorable. It really, really stood out to me this year as such a unique book. Now, for the decade is To All the Boys I've Loved Before by Jenny Han. And this one was because this was really the first like real book I'd read in a day. Of course, I can get through like children's books, picture books, graphic novels, things like that in a day, but this is the first like book with like some substantial number of pages that I sat and read in like one day, one sitting. I just totally devoured this book, and I was just so shocked that I sat down and read the entire thing in one single day, one single sitting. So that totally stuck out to me, and I really have enjoyed that book. I've read that one twice over the past few years and really, really enjoyed it. So those are two that stuck out to me the most over the decade. Now, the next one is the one that I found most applicable, the one that I actually learned something from that I could use in my real life. Now, in this, I don't mean it to be as deep as what it sounds, because this year's was definitely not deep. This year's was a book called Sandwiches that I bought at the Scholastic book sale, and I'm trying to remember what the author's name is, Allison Deering, and I just thought this was so adorable. It's basically just a cookbook for a bunch of different types of sandwiches. Some of them sounded horrific and some of them sounded really good, and mostly I just enjoyed that it was such a simple little cookbook, because I am not a cook at all, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I could totally make this sandwich. I was really excited to read it. It was so much fun. I know we sold a couple of them because I thought it was so much fun. The kids saw me reading it, and a couple were sold at our book fair. Now, as for the decade, the most like applicable book, this one's a little bit deeper, and that is The Four Agreements. And this is just like a kind of a self-help book that really looks at what you can do kind of on your own to make things a little bit better for yourself. So there are like essentially 4 agreements that you have with yourself that help you interact with people and help you live a more like fulfilling life. And this is by Don Miguel Ruiz, and I actually read this twice last year as part of kind of a self-help book club that I had going last year with a friend, and I think every time I read this, I take a little bit more from it. But one of the things that I can think off the top of my head that I've been working on is not taking things so personally. Other people do things, and most of the time it has nothing to do with you. It's really not personal at all. So I'm working on that. That's one of the agreements, and I just really like this book. It's pretty short, it's pretty easy to get through, and I mean, it seems like it's fairly helpful when I need a little like self-pep talk. So I would say over the decade, probably The Four Agreements has been the most applicable to my life. Next up is the book or books that I recommend the most. Now, as a librarian and just kind of a general book like freak, I recommend books pretty often to kids, obviously, as part of my job, and then just to other people as a friend. So I recommend books for their children, I recommend books for them, to adults, to just kind of all across the gambit. So the one that I probably recommended the most this year was the Bad Guy series by Aaron Blabey, and I have recommended that so much on this channel because I just think it's perfect for a younger audience and even an older audience, because I love them. I have them all. I just bought the 10th book in the series and I cannot wait to read it. They're super short. It's just a graphic novel formatting, so it's really easy to get through. It's all in like black and white. I just love Aaron Blabey's sense of humor, and I think that it's really fun for girls and boys, but particularly boys at an age where sometimes it's hard to get them really excited about reading, and it's just super funny. The whole series is about a group of animals that are typically bad animals, like a wolf, a shark, a piranha, and they're trying to be good guys and save the world. And as you can imagine, things just keep going wrong, and it's so much fun. I absolutely love it. Another book that I've recommended a ton, especially at school this year, has been Lore by Erin Mankey. There are 3 books in the series, and we read one of them for our high school book club, as I mentioned earlier, and the other 2 are also very good. It's very much based on kind of the historical reasons behind a lot of lore we believe. So, like, the very first one in the first book, I think it was the very first episode of the podcast, was about the first American vampire. Basically, this stemmed from a case of consumption or tuberculosis in New England in America, and it all tied in to create this vampiric setting. And he goes into all the detail of what led to each piece of this and how that lore has grown in our culture. And it just really explains it. It still lets it be a little mysterious, because sometimes there's like creature sightings in the first book, Monstrous Creatures, that even as a rational adult who doesn't believe in mythical creatures, you might still be like, I don't know what is happening here. This is kind of abnormal. You can't explain away what's happening. So I just think they were a lot of fun. I really enjoy the books. I think the most out of all of the media coming out from the world of lore. So I highly recommend those books to people, and that's been one of my top recommendations this year. Now, overall for the decade, I would say the top 2 books I recommend to pretty much everybody, but particularly at school and at the high school the most, is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir and Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. Now, Ember in the Ashes is a fantasy series, and it is really, really great. There's a lot of violence, so sometimes I know I have some readers who it's going to be a little too much for, but typically it appeals to boys and girls. It appeals to people who like fantasy and kind of historical fiction, military-based fiction, and I just think it's a really fast-paced, interesting read, and it's a series, so it keeps you reading. Between Shades of Grey is one I recommend because a lot of our students have read The Book Thief as part of an English class at the high school, and if they like The Book Thief, I can pretty much guarantee they're going to like Between Shades of Grey, because it is very much set in the same time frame. It gives a lot of the same emotions, a lot of the same kind of struggles, but in this case, it is not set in Germany, it is set in Lithuania and Siberia, and it's dealing with kind of the Russian side of things, with Stalin basically kicking the Lithuanians out and forcing them into labor camps in Siberia. And again, it's very emotional, it's very historically interesting, and I just find that a lot of kids who really like The Book Thief really like Ruta Sepetys' writing and her interesting twist on historical representation in her fiction. So those are my probably 2 biggest recommendations from the decade. Now, my most surprising read this year was Captain Underpants by Dave Pilkey. I obviously have known about this book for a long time. It is one of our most highly circulated books in our elementary libraries, and I just could not, basically, with this book. But I finally decided this year, I think if I could read it, maybe I can figure out why they like it so much and be able to recommend other books to them as well. Although it's not really necessary because they immediately leap from Captain Underpants to Dogman now. But I thought maybe I would be able to kind of bridge that gap between just continually circulating between Captain Underpants and Dogman to something else. But overall, I was very surprised. I was not expecting much at all from these books, and I thought this first one was very funny, and I actually really enjoyed it. Now, I also did read Dogman this year, did not enjoy that one as much. I actually liked Captain Underpants better, which, again, totally surprised by, but I did. I really enjoyed it. It is goofy. There's a lot of bathroom humor. I don't think it's for most adults or even like teens, but for that like middle grade boy range, I mean, it just is like the sweet spot for them, and they're actually pretty funny. So that was my biggest surprise for this year. I kind of already mentioned a little bit my most surprising book for the decade because I read Harry Potter in like 2008. Didn't love it. As a person who's really liked reading and books her whole life, with this being such a huge book moment, I'm surprised I wasn't kind of sucked into the Harry Potter world, but I just wasn't. And I think all the hype actually kind of scared me away. I really didn't like fantasy at the time. I mean, I guess I did. I was reading more like vampire werewolf stuff though, and the Harry Potter world just did not appeal to me. But I decided to give it another try because I'm like, I must be crazy because I love books and everybody else loves these books and I don't. So I just felt totally left out. But I reread it again. I mixed in the audiobook with Jim Dale, and I mean, I just fell in love with this world. The world building was just so fantastic. I mean, I really, really like the first book. I know some people aren't crazy about the first book. They think it's not one of the best in the series, but I mean, just the way we were able to dive into this world and explore it with Harry, it's just absolutely amazing. So when I circled back to it in 2015, I fell in love and am now completely converted. I really enjoy the Harry Potter series. I have not finished all of them yet because I feel like I want to take it like super slow because you can never like go back and reread it again for the first time. So I've been taking it super slow reading through all of them, but I guarantee you I will make it through all of them. And then I'm watching the movies as I go. And we got to go to Harry Potter World. Like, I'm totally in. I found my house, total Ravenclaw. I'm in all the way now. But that was probably the most surprising read of the decade, considering how much I was not into it early on in that first read. Most shocking. I guess this is my category for something that really stuck with me as, like, not necessarily in a good way, but not necessarily in a bad way either. These are books that I really, really enjoyed, but like, it was like such a hard topic, if that makes sense. The most shocking this year by far was Shout by Laurie Halse Anderson. It's hard to say you enjoy reading a book about rape and rape culture, but I mean, it's just so powerful and moving that it's just a fantastic book. But it's shocking, and I mean, it really hits you, I think. So by far, the most shocking book this year for me was Shout. The most shocking over the decade, Brain on Fire by Susanna Cahalan. This was completely terrifying. I tell everybody it's probably one of the scariest books I've ever read. This poor girl develops like basically an infection in her brain that leads her to be dubbed as essentially mentally ill and almost sent to a mental hospital for like the rest of her life because the doctors just didn't know what to do. She was becoming paranoid and kind of violent. They just assumed she had developed schizophrenia, while all the time it's just this infection on her brain. And I mean, it was just absolutely terrifying. And then probably another one of the most shocking books that just was horrific to read was The Blood of Emmett Till. Oh my goodness. If you have not read anything about Emmett Till, you absolutely need to. The more I read and the more I got into it, the more horrified I was, which obviously is the point of this book. But I mean, again, it's one you cannot say that you enjoyed because it's not like a fun read. It's not like a good read. It's just a necessary read. It's very gripping. It's very shocking. I mean, it's just, oh my goodness. That left a very lasting impact on me, and I'm very glad that I read it. Overall, I thought the writing of the book was okay, but it's just the story, the information that you gain from this book is just insane. And this was by Timothy Tyson. Again, the writing was pretty okay for me, but the story was just totally shocking and overwhelming, and it's one that will definitely stick with me. The most like out of my lane books, the ones that like really, I'm sure people would be kind of shocked that I really liked so much and that I wasn't anticipating liking as much. So this year it was a little harder to pick because I am getting pretty wide in my reading habits. Like, I read literally books for all ages. I read pretty much all genres except maybe like westerns. I don't really read any like westerns or like super hard fantasy. Overall, One thing I don't read a lot of is manga. So this year I picked up the life-changing manga of Tidying Up as a challenge for the Read Harder Book Riot challenge for the year. And it was a lot like the premise of Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, but it was presented as a story in manga format. And overall it was fine, but I just am not into like the manga style. I don't particularly relate to the art, and reading it backwards just totally gives me like the OCD nightmares. So I have a really hard time with manga. Luckily this one went forward, so that really helped, but it was in like the traditional kind of manga style. But that was probably the most out of my lane this year. Out of my lane overall would be the Lunch Lady series by Jared Krasoska. I really did not read any graphic novels at all for a long time. Like, I just didn't get into them. I didn't really understand them. I wasn't in the mood for them. I didn't feel the need to read them. I really just didn't get graphic novels. I didn't really care if I got them. I just didn't really engage at all with this medium. But once I discovered BookTube and I really started seriously considering becoming a librarian, especially at a school, I knew this is something I was going to have to get a little bit of experience with. So I dove in. I think the very first graphic novel I ever read was during my library degree program, where I read Mouse, which is a graphic novel by Art Spiegelman essentially about the Holocaust, kind of like Animal Farm style, where the people were represented by cats and mice in the setting of the Holocaust. It was okay. I didn't enjoy it that much because it was a graphic novel, but I knew I could appreciate the story and the representation, but it never moved me to read a graphic novel for the longest time. But in 2015, I decided, let's do this. So I was inspired by a lot of booktubers who do read graphic novels, and I just decided to find something that I liked in a graphic novel format. And what I found first at my local library was a graphic novel version of Dexter by Jeff Lindsay. And I did not really care for it. I think I gave it 1 star. I much preferred the show to even the books, and definitely to the graphic novels. Didn't like it. I decided to read a few more. I got a children's graphic novel that I just was like, Again, I just couldn't find it. I got another one that I was recommended on BookTube that I just didn't care for. But the first graphic novel that I picked up and just fell in love with was by Jared Krasoska, and that was The Lunch Lady and the Cyborg Substitute. And that really launched me into graphic novels. I read all 10 of those within the span of like a couple of months and was just really hungry for more. Like, I got it. I just really enjoyed it. And I realized then that there are going to be graphic novels that I do enjoy. I won't necessarily enjoy them all, just like books. So I really think that the Lunch Lady series overall is a big out of my lane kind of series, because I never thought I would have a graphic novel series that I enjoyed as much as the Lunch Lady series. And now I'm always talking about the Bad Guy series. So this really launched me into graphic novels, and I was able to really tell him this in like a really short format of this when I met him earlier this year. But for me, that really led me into seeing how important graphic novels are for kids and how they engage with graphic novels. So most out of my lane for sure for the decade. Most on brand, most in my lane for this year, that is Dead Mountain by Donnie Icar, and this was just a really, really interesting book. I tend to like things that are kind of maybe a little gory and weird and creepy, and this reads like a true crime book. It's nonfiction. It's about these hikers in Siberia that just essentially died of very unnatural causes. They don't really know what happened to them. They were very trained, so the fact that all of them died, most of them were not dressed for the weather. Most of them seemed to be running in a direction that would not have been very helpful for them. All of the people who found these poor people like dead on the mountain said that they don't understand what drove them out of this tent without proper dress and some just strange things happen to them that they really can't explain. So totally on brand for me. I really enjoyed it, if you can say that about poor people who are not necessarily murdered, but killed in a very strange, dramatic way. Really young, too, but it's just so interesting because I don't know what happened to them. Even after reading all this, it's just a fascinating case. So definitely on brand for me. I would say probably the two most on brand books for me over the decade are The Psychopath Test by I almost said Ron Swanson. By Jon Ronson, and this is really just his look at what makes a psychopath and where we find psychopaths in our world. And yeah, I feel like that's just totally on brand for me. I'm all about like true crime stuff, into like how people are different because of their brains, and I just totally felt like that was on brand for me. Another one that is totally on brand for me is By Your Side by Casey West. I push Casey West a lot at the high school because I know most of the kids like teen romances. However, my book club students do not, and when I had them read By Your Side, they were not big fans, but it's totally for me. This girl finds love, like cheesy teen love, which I love, and over the course of a weekend locked in the library. I mean, come on. Like, I feel like it's totally on brand for me. No one is surprised that I liked that book. And yeah, it's probably one of the most on brand for the last 10 years. So, my most read authors. Technically this year it's going to be Edgar Allan Poe, because I read His Hideous Heart, which is a bind up of a bunch of retellings of Edgar Allan Poe's work, plus the actual Edgar Allan Poe works. So I ended up reading 13 stories by Edgar Allan Poe just because of this one book. So Poe is technically my most read author, but book-wise, I actually read 2 by Catherine Arden. I read Small Spaces. I also read Dead Voices, which is the sequel. And I also read 2 by R.L. Stine because it's R.L. Stine. I love reading R.L. Stine books. Now, over the course of the last 10 years, I've read 12 books by Gabrielle Lord. These books were basically, one took place every month, and it was an adventure series at the middle school where I was teaching and preparing to start a book club. This was back when I was a math teacher, and I just kind of plowed through this series. So over the decade, I read all 12 in the series, the January through December books. So technically, she's my most read author. Beyond that, I've read 12 books also by Aaron Blabey, but that includes picture books and all the Bad Guy series. I've also read 10 by Jarrett Krasoska, which I mentioned earlier, the Lunch Lady series, and I read 9 by Maggie Stiefvater. I have also read 8 by Casey West. Now, for the best of the best picture book this year that I read, the first one is After the Fall by Dan Santat. It's probably my favorite picture book, definitely of this year, maybe of all time. It's amazing. It's basically what happened to Humpty Dumpty after he fell off the wall. It's inspired by his wife's anxiety. It's essentially what's happening to Humpty Dumpty. He's afraid now to climb up the wall. Oh, it's so moving. The ending just blows me away. It always surprises the kids, and I think it's just absolutely fantastic. I think Dan Santat cannot do anything wrong, really. Also, Potato Pants by Lori Keller. This was just a super fun book that I read this year. The kids really enjoyed it. It's about this little potato that wants to go buy some pants, and it's just super silly, super fun. I really, really liked it. Now, as for all time, obviously I already mentioned I really like After the Fall. Thelma the Unicorn is definitely one of my favorite books, children books ever. It's about this little unicorn, this little pony who wants to be a unicorn, and oh my gosh, it's the best. It's by Aaron Blabey. He's fantastic. Again, I don't think he can do anything wrong either. Thelma the Unicorn is absolutely amazing, and the sequel, The Return of Thelma, just came out, and it's also just as good, and it's fantastic. Now, best middle grade. I haven't been reading a ton of middle grade. That's probably like my worst area of reading, so goals for next year. But this year, my favorite middle grade book was The Terrible Two. This is by Mac Barnett and Jory John, with illustrations by Kevin Cornell, I think is his name. Yes, Kevin Cornell. This was hilarious. It was like kind of prank wars, and I think the kids are going to like it. There's enough illustrations to keep it interesting. It kind of feels like it could almost be a graphic novel, but there's some substance to it, and it's just really funny. I plan on reading this with some 5th graders later this year. Overall, for the decade, it would probably be Save Me a Seat. This was by Sarah Weeks and Gita Varadarajan, and this was just a wonderful, heartfelt story about two friends at a middle school during one of like the hardest times in middle school, which is lunch. And it was just a really sweet, sweet book. It deals with like bullying and emotions and, like I said, middle grade stuff and standing out, being different, being accepted. It was just a really, really good book, and I really enjoyed that one. So it was probably my favorite of the decade. Best YA book that I read this year was definitely Aurora Rising by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff. I had kind of a slumpy reading year, and I just was not getting excited about a ton of books, and I was very excited about Aurora Rising. So it's just has to be my favorite of the year. We're going to be reading it with our book club later this year, and I'm super excited to revisit it and explore it with our kiddos, and I'm super excited for the sequel to come out this coming year. If you haven't read Aurora Rising, it's kind of like a little bit of like a heist situation with kind of a rogue team of space cadets, and it's just very interesting. I really, really liked it, and I'm looking forward to the sequel. Overall, for the decade, I would have to say In Burn the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. It's probably one of just my favorite fantasy novels overall. Definitely one of my favorite YA books for the decade, and it's just so awesome. I've read it a couple times, and I'm definitely going to do a reread before the next few books in the series come out, so I'm excited about that. The best adult book that I read this year was The Hunger by Alma Katsu. This was kind of a reimagining of the Donner Party during the Oregon Trail, and it was creepy and atmospheric and like just totally everything I wanted it to be. It was very creepy though, so I wouldn't recommend it to everybody, but if you do kind of like a little bit of creep factor, totally worth it. It was really, really interesting, and I really, really enjoyed it. I read it originally from the library, and I just ended up having to buy my own copy recently, so I have one in my collection now. I don't know if this one counts as an adult book, but I'm going to count it as an adult book. So my favorite adult book for the decade, I'm gonna say, is Pride and Prejudice. Now, some people call that like YA, but I think originally it was written for adults, so that's what I'm going with. But it's definitely Pride and Prejudice because it's probably my favorite book ever. I just can't imagine there being a book that I like more than that. Maybe I would like to challenge the world to create this book that I would like more than Pride and Prejudice, but I just love the story. I think it's just so cute and fantastic and wonderful, and I really love the hate to love trope. Like, I know it's overdone, but if it's done well, it's just so enjoyable and fantastic, and I love it. Now, the best nonfiction book that I read this year was Everything's Trash, But That's Okay by Phoebe Robinson, and this is just a collection of essays by Phoebe. This is, I believe, her second book, and it's very much, like, it feels like she's just sitting there talking to you because it's very much in her voice, and I just appreciate her voice. I appreciate her experiences and her references, and I just think it's so much fun to read her essay collections. So I would highly recommend Phoebe Robinson if you have not. I haven't totally gotten into her podcasts, but I just really enjoy her books. Again, highly recommend them. And this one is so funny. If you feel a little overwhelmed and sad about the world at any time, this is perfect for you. Everything's trash, but it's okay. Next, for the decade, I would either say Unbroken or the Lore series. Now, I've already talked to you a lot about the Lore series in this video, so I won't talk about it anymore, but I did read Unbroken before the movie came out with a book club that we kind of started that didn't last very long, and this was one of the first books I'd read that was kind of like an eye-opener. Like, you read so much historical fiction and nonfiction about the Holocaust, but this was one that was not about the Holocaust, but it was set in World War II, and I just felt like I learned so much. Like, I just feel like I had not been exposed to this type of setting and information and this type of story before. So I very much enjoyed it. I found it very impactful, and I found it very interesting, and I definitely recommend this to a lot of my students. I was just really surprised by how much I liked this book because I don't tend to like war-ish books, especially nonfiction, but I definitely enjoyed this one. Best audiobook of the year. I would say it either has to be Stay Sexy and Don't Get Murdered or Shout. Both of those I mentioned already from favorites of this year, but both of those were just fantastic audiobooks. Would highly recommend it. Now, overall, I would say, originally I immediately said The Graveyard Book, but when I looked back, I actually read that in 2009. It wouldn't work for the decade, but I do believe from the records that I've kept that The Graveyard Book was actually the very first audiobook that I ever read, and I actually really, really liked it. When I decided to do my reread of Harry Potter, I decided to pick up the audio, and of course, Jim Dale is just a dream, and it has to be the best audiobook of the decade. Jim Dale's narration of the Harry Potter series is just fantastic. I mean, it's just fantastic. That's all you can say. If you have not listened to him narrate, you need to, because it just totally adds something to the whole experience. So, best graphic novel. I would say my favorite graphic novel that I read this year was Bad Guys Volume 9. I'm getting ready to read Volume 10, so maybe technically that could change for this year. But Volume 9, I just love the bad guys. Again, I've talked about it so much here, I won't continue, but I just love them. My probably favorite graphic novel that I've read in the decade, originally I was thinking maybe the Lunch Lady series because I do love it so, so much, but I really think that Nimona might be my favorite overall graphic novel because it's just such a fun story. It really takes the kind of trope of the hero and the villain and kind of turns it on its head a little bit, and I just like it. I felt like I really like the art style. It was kind of like my kind of sarcasm without being really sarcastic, and it was just really, really enjoyable. I've read it a couple times, and I really, really enjoy it. The longest book that I read this year was definitely Pet Sematary at 560 pages, and then ironically enough, Stephen King also was the longest book for the decade for me. Can you guess what it was? It was literally, at 1,473 pages in my copy. Now, I know a lot of copies vary, but it's still over 1,000 pages, so it's definitely the longest one that I read. I did not enjoy it, though. I found it to be very problematic. This is really weird to say it, and the title's it, but I just found a lot of things to be very problematic, and I didn't enjoy it. It was way too long, and I almost totally gave up on Stephen King after reading it, but I have a few more that I may try. I just don't get into Stephen King's writing. I don't like his style. I know other people do, and that's fine, but I think he just may not be for me. But both times in the decade and this year, he's had my longest book. Now, for the number of books read total, I have, at this point, with a few days left in the year, read 81 books this year. That's a little bit low for me of what I've been reading the last, 5-ish years, but I did have a really rocky reading year, so I'm still pretty proud that I got 81. I'm hoping to maybe sneak in at least one more, maybe up to 3. We'll see how the next few days go, but 81 for sure. And I have 592 for the past decade, so almost 600 books in a decade. My reading really, really jumped up in about the middle of the decade. I was going from reading 30 books or less a year to over 100. And I think that went up with the inclusion of audiobooks and graphic novels and just generally me getting super into reading. While I was taking classes and while I was a student and also working full time, there just wasn't the time to get excited about books and really find ones that I loved. So I don't think I read as much because I didn't have time and I wasn't enjoying it. But once my classes stopped, I really got into it. Then I found BookTube, which gave me a lot more insight into popular books. I also just, with my library degree, became a lot more aware of, publishing and options and different types of books. And like I said, then I found audiobooks and graphic novels, which really escalated my reading. So I'm hoping in the next decade, it's going to be even more than 600. So that will be awesome. And then roughly, I've read about 20-ish thousand pages this year. For the full decade, I've read almost 1,450,000 pages, with an average rating of about 3.3 this year and 3.4 for the entire decade, which seems pretty on point. So overall, I'm just totally impressed with my reading habits. I am so glad that I started tracking. I actually started tracking my reading at least in a spreadsheet, the year I did my student teaching, which was 2006. And I believe it was about halfway through the year that I started tracking in 2006. And then I have just been kind of escalating the tracking ever since. So I feel like my data is a lot more in-depth and exciting now. So I am going to do probably a quick 2000 and, well, it probably won't be quick. It'll probably be long-winded like this video, but I'm going to do a little wrap-up of the year and give you all the books I read and a few more little stats about 2019 in a future video. But I just wanted to kind of compare the two decades a little bit and just see where things ended up. But I really wanted just to sit down and kind of compare some reading things and discuss my reading habits over the year versus the decade, since it was the end of the decade. So thank you for sticking around for the super long-winded video, and I will see you again soon in another video. Bye for now.